We basically had a discussion, didn't we, a few weeks ago about getting together and just dialoguing really about the current situation and noticing perhaps things that we haven't really noticed before.
Yeah.
And by opening this dialogue up, we're hoping that it can move ideas and modes of seeing and knowing in different ways, and other people can resonate with it. And you came up with the lovely title of "The World is Speaking to Us." How do we listen, and as well as, how do we see that, and how do we respond, and what does it all really mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the title was inspired by religious philosopher Joseph Milne. I was in a seminar with him last year, and he was talking about, the world is always speaking to us, and how we live is our reply. And I just thought, that is really, really beautiful.
Yeah.
And so that was really how it was, how the title came about, because there's so much going on right now that, so much we could talk about. And really for me, it was about, well, if the world is talking to us through whatever is arising, be that the world speaking to us through ecological speak, through the ice caps melting, for example, or through, and I know we're probably going to delve more deeply into this in a few weeks maybe, but coronavirus, the current pandemic, if the world is speaking to us, how we live is our reply. And so it just seemed like a really great opportunity to talk about these ideas in relation to our own our own ways of thinking and seeing.
Yes. And also, I think initially, for somebody out there who hasn't really thought about the world speaking to us, might seem a bit of a strange concept, or something that goes against the grain, because it's certainly not something that we're used to understanding or being brought up with, that idea of response and perception. And I think part of what we're hoping to do here, and as you mentioned before in conversations we've had, that we're not here to, there's no preaching, and that we're not sort of saying we've got all the answers at all. This is purely, so much we don't know as human beings. But I do think that the idea that the human has become a solitary force in the world, and the human psyche is just sort of trapped inside the human brain, is an issue, and is part of the problem as to why we might have got into the mess that we have in the first place. And I think the idea that the world is speaking to us shifts the attention a little away from ourselves just for a moment, to seeing that perhaps there is something going on outside of our usual capsule of being a human that we might not even be aware of. We don't even know we're missing a lot of things. So it'll be interesting to explore that. And do you want to just say a little bit about, so your background is in Goethean science and holistic science, but you didn't just suddenly arrive at that, did you?
No, definitely not. No, it was something that took place over a number of years. So I think really I'm starting, I'm sort of leaping off from the early 2000s now in this conversation, in this dialogue. And working in a normal, ordinary 9-to-5 job, and getting extremely burnt out and stressed, dealing with a lot of other life issues, as many people are. Difficulty in family dynamics, family relationships. I was going through a divorce. My work was just so much pressure, so much stress. And I really just started to think, what am I doing? What is this about? What is life about? And I'd kind of come to this question for the second time, really, because when I was 18, so this is, another 15 years previously, so this is 1990s now, I caught a heart virus, which left me, in hospital for 3 months, and the doctors weren't sure I was going to pull through. So there was a definite theme arising for me of how am I rising, or how am I living in the world? What is my reply to the world? And following the heart virus, I just went back to normality. But when I started to have all of these issues back in the early 2000s, I just recall one night just waking up extremely anxious. You know, I used to have awful panic attacks, and I was claustrophobic, agoraphobic, you know, for such a long time. And my heart just saying to me, "What are you doing, Louise? You have the power to change this, but you're not only killing yourself, you're killing me." And it was a real kind of wake-up call. And then from that point, really, it was, I started to notice, but I didn't really know what I was noticing, because I hadn't been educated in a particular way to understand what was arising. I just knew, I sensed, felt, intuited, and obviously this is the theme of today's dialogue. I sensed, felt, intuited, knew somewhere deep inside me that the way I was living my life was just not healthy, not right. The way I was thinking about things just wasn't right. So to cut a very, very long story short, I left my job and just started to explore with alternative therapies, Reiki, Indian head massage, crystal therapy. Started to look at the world very differently, but I still felt like, you know, I wasn't quite reaching a different place. It was like I was doing all these other therapies, but I was still coming at it from the place that I knew how to come at the world. Does that make sense? So in the way that I've been educated to know, I was still coming at all of these alternative therapies. And then one day, an email just popped into my inbox from the Schumacher College and said, MSc Holistic Science, recruiting for next year. And this was 2013. And I said to my husband, I'm going to do that. And I can't tell you why. I just knew I was going to do it. But the only way we could do it was to sell our house and all our possessions. So we did it. We sold everything so I could do this course. But this course changed my life. And, you know, I was introduced to something called Goethean enquiry. So many people will know Johann Goethe as the poet, German poet, romantic poet. But what is not so well known is that he actually was also exploring science. So he was a scientist as well. And we'll go obviously deeper into his method as the weeks unfold. But it was about looking at or engaging with the world from a point that we don't know it. From the point that the way that I would engage with the world previously in my normal day-to-day life would be that I knew it already. I'd given it a label. An oak tree outside is an oak tree. It's an oak tree, that's it. That's all I know. But what Goethe's inquiry does is it actually sets you in a dialogue, in conversation with the subject of your inquiry, be that a plant or an animal or whatever. And you enter into a conversation with it. But in my case, it was just sitting and looking and being with it. And I had a revelatory experience, and I started to, the more I did this, it seemed really strange at first, but the more I did it, it made more sense to me, and there was an expansion to my perception. And then following the masters, I went on, and I've just completed a PhD actually. So I started a PhD at Canterbury Christchurch University, and it was about looking at the heart in relation to conflict. But as I started to do the PhD, I realized that not only did a different way of seeing, a kind of more expansive way of seeing, has applicability not just in conflict situations, but in social justice, in the way that we look at the world in terms of ecology. So there are greater implications to all of this, which I'm obviously, you know, very deeply involved in exploring. So really, it was about a whole shift in knowing how I knew to know, to opening up to knowing differently. And there's a very subtle difference in those ways of seeing.
That's fascinating, Louise. It's, when you were talking, I was thinking of many different parallels, and especially when you mentioned Goethe as well. But I just backtrack a little bit, because I think something that you said that really resonated was that you can learn all about, you know, in my case, it was sort of yoga, meditation. I was completely swept up in the whole New Age movement in my early 20s when I lived in California for a couple of years, which were fantastic times. But I was still coming at the world from, well, I suppose what Dr. McGilchrist would say, a left hemisphere view. that, okay, I understood yogic philosophy having a sort of certain cosmological structure, but I saw that cosmology from a left rational mind and couldn't quite sort of switch into looking at the world in different ways. But Goethe, interestingly, when you were talking about Goethe, he also wrote, and I don't know if you've read it, a wonderful account of his experience of looking at Strasbourg Cathedral. And he talks to it and he writes as if it's a prayer. And I think he looks at nature in the same way, you know, his scientific or Goethean way of looking at a flower, as you've described, in order to widen your perception, to cross a threshold in a way, to see through to something much broader and bigger and deeper. But it's not a bypass, it's not skipping over the beauty of the thing itself, or the material embodiment of whatever it is. And it's a wonderful account of Strasbourg Cathedral where he sensed that the cathedral itself was speaking to him and that it was missing one of its spires. And when he went and looked back at the original plans, it was actually supposed to have another spire and it was never built. And he intuited that just from listening and looking at the cathedral. Lots of people in the modern world would think you've lost the plot if you talk to a cathedral or a work of art or a flower. Actually, it's a very beautiful thing to do.
It is, and it's, as you were talking, it's like it's the and. So we're not losing anything from what we're seeing, but we are making a space for the and, for the something more, for the for the mysterious, or something other to shine through. And you know, for Goethe, that was very, for him, it was very connected to his understanding of what the divine was. And I mean, I think we'll probably get more into this as we go on in the following weeks, but he was very influenced by Platonic philosophy. You know, this idea that yes, we can look at something intellectually, and to use McGilchrist's terms, from a left brain hemisphere point of view, but that doesn't mean that other ways of seeing or knowing have actually disappeared. They are there, because as human beings, we are I understand that I am an organ of perception. You know, I am an expert in living life because I'm a human being, and I've been on this planet for almost 5 decades now. So as an organ of perception, we have all of these different ways of knowing available to us. Essentially speaking, probably since the Enlightenment, and really for the past century, what we have done is ended up in a more kind of narrow version of the potential space, or the potential perceptual space that we could be inhabiting. That doesn't mean to say that it's wacky or woo-woo. It's just that we have placed a narrative or a coating around these other ways that we're tentatively exploring, Mary, in our conversation, that are still there, that are still part of our, that we're able to reach as an organ of perception. But they're overlaid by a coating that, or they're just kind of gently put aside so that they're not relevant. But what that means is then we start to create a world then that is so very narrow in its focus. Those parts haven't left us. I mean, you know, when I start to tune in to the world, I can hear it chattering. It's never gone away.
Yes, and also, as you said there, you know, obviously our main viewpoint today is a rationalizing one, and it's not only that the rationalizing view has blocked out you know, other ways of knowing and seeing and intuiting and being in the world and coexisting in the world, but actually the rational mind itself has become overworked as well. And overinflated, because we have to have the rational mind as well. It's just because it's not working in its usual capacity with the other modes of seeing and being, it's become top heavy and lopsided. And you know, we're functioning in a well, to lots of people there's nothing wrong with the world. There are lots of wonderful things as well, and I certainly wouldn't want to go back 2 years where the medical and scientific knowledge wasn't there. You know, if you sort of damage your leg and you need to have it amputated, well, thank goodness we have the means with which to do that now. Tooth extraction,
Absolutely.
these things.
Yeah, because I wouldn't be here without it. So
Right, exactly. So it's not, it's more about opening up, I think, and allowing different ways of seeing and being and thinking to coexist. And that's also why the Renaissance was always so appealing to me, because I started off studying Renaissance art academically. And I always sensed there was more to it than the academic rhetoric that I was being taught. And at the same time, I became a yoga and meditation teacher and mindfulness teacher, and I was trying to sort of find correlations between the two. And I found that neither the academic history of art was telling me the full story, or possibly showing it in ways. And I found that the yoga and meditation world became so not about the mind-body connection. It became, the sort of things like the imagination were frozen out, and there wasn't a place in that world that I found to discuss broader ways of being and seeing it. It actually became quite rigid and quite dogmatic, almost in a sort of sense that some people might perceive some aspects of religion. But the reason the Renaissance is so fascinating to me is because it was a time when all these modes of seeing and knowing and thinking and being in the world came together. And they didn't come together to be mixed into a murky mess where you couldn't discern one from the other. They sat next to each other and complemented each other and coexisted. But each way had its place. And it's very interesting that we're not used to thinking in that way anymore. We were talking the other day, and we've become so either or. It's either that or it's that, but it can be both and something else. And that was a very usual way of thinking, maybe sort of, a few hundred years ago. And it absolutely, in the Renaissance, it was its absolute sort of pinnacle time when that sat together. But I spoke to a traditional art historian recently, wonderful lady, and she said to me, she's found that even when she teaches her classes of A-level students, that younger people today are finding it harder to really grasp that understanding that you can think in that way and you can think in that way, and they don't have to be in conflict with each other, a holding of different ways of seeing and knowing at the same time. And that's becoming harder and harder, I think, for people to do.
I think so. And I if I would think back to one of my first modules when I sort of arrived at Schumacher College, and we went and walked up to the source of the River Dart on Dartmoor. It was just a beautiful experience. And in the same way that we're talking now, because this way of seeing and thinking to me is kind of so second nature now. It's taken a long time to learn. But I remember saying to my tutor, you mean you can think this way, that you're allowed to think this way? And he actually said to me, Louise, the words that you've just used there are really interesting. That you're asking me if you're allowed to think this way. And I thought, gosh, yes, isn't that interesting? Because that word allow suggests so much from our education, particularly mine, where, you're only really allowed to think in a certain kind of way. The imagination, having that both and kind of view, wasn't part of my education, sadly. It might have been for others, but it certainly wasn't for mine. And I think that's why I just felt this kind of such a visceral sense that there must be so much more, but how do I access that? And so I think that for you, like you're talking, that Renaissance art really was the kind of access point for you. And really for me it was my ongoing relationship, my ongoing difficult relationship with my heart, which was continually kind of trying to make itself known in my life, and then combining that with Goethean enquiry, which just opened up my eyes, my perception, my world to so much more. And I don't label that openness as anything in particular. you know, again, you know, I'm not talking from a sense of whether I know what it is God or the divine or universal source. I don't know, but I'm happy to rest and hold that not knowing.
Yes, yes,
Um,
absolutely. Well, I think it has to not be known to a
yeah,
certain extent as well, doesn't
yeah,
it? You know, because you can't know. But
no,
in the not knowing that you can't know, that's expansive in itself, isn't it? Because you've relaxed the grasp on
yeah,
something
yeah,
of having to
yeah,
know it. And having said that, at the same time, that is that drive, or not, or that sort of pull, actually, things that pull us towards them. And there's not one aspect of my own life experience that wasn't absolutely necessary at that time, in terms of following the route through yoga and meditation. And so I had some of the most profound insights after doing long meditation retreats and that sort of thing. And that's fine, that served its purpose there. And then coming back to Renaissance art and its deeper sort of soulful meaning, I suppose. You know, they complement each other. It's not that one was wrong and the other was right. They are absolutely there. You know.
absolutely. I think I was having a similar conversation with my husband yesterday, and I think we were talking about this earlier on in the week, weren't we, about this push pull, you know, the past kind of reaching out to us, you know.
Yes.
If we think about our, you know, philosophical tradition and our own foundations, which, you know, reaching out from Plato all the way forward to where we are now, the past is reaching out to us, but also I think equally we're reaching back to the past, and there's like this push pull. And I was trying to explain to my husband about, you know, groundsel, which we will talk a little bit more about next week, which was my experience with a weed called groundsel on my master's course. And I was saying, well, we need all of these steps, you know. We need Platonic understanding, we need, you know, what Aristotle put forward, we need the Enlightenment, we need these new ways of thinking, because if we took a Goethean eye to that, you could then place the analogy of the roots of the plant, then moving up to the first leaf, moving up, you know, the stem to the second leaf, the third leaf, the fourth leaf, rising all the way up to the top, to the head of the flower. And if we consider that that's where we are now, which is the head of the flower, we needed all of those leaves, those roots, those steps, the stalk,
Right.
the stem, to have got us to where we are now. So
Yes.
if we're cutting away through a sort of more left brain, rationalist, narrow inquiry to say that those are the bits of the plant, those are the bits of our history and what makes us who we are today, we cut them out. There's no plant, there's no flower, there's
Absolutely.
nothing.
Absolutely. And that's a really beautiful analogy, and it marries very beautifully with some of, you know, my own thoughts that have come from looking at Renaissance art and the Renaissance itself, in that and also from my own point of view, in that in the New Age world that I found myself looking at and reading quite a lot of books. And don't get me wrong, there's some fantastic insights and teachers there. But what I found quite profoundly missing, which I felt very deeply in my bones that I needed to go back and discover, was an aspect of the historical that I felt was really missing. It was sort of severed, really, from anything in that. There was no, it was all about moving forwards and optimism and being happy and being a sort of enforced happiness, if you like, which didn't feel natural to me. And I felt something was really lacking in its approach, where it doesn't look back. And for me, the Renaissance was so interesting because it's fantastic outpouring, an expression of art, which is expressing something so much more than the art as well, and deeper philosophical, spiritual, soulful ways of knowing and wisdom, and all this wonderful outpouring, which just sort of gushed out from the beginning of the 1400s, was driven by the fact, or was happened because they looked back to the richness of the past. and at particular points of the past, golden ages, as they would call it, golden age of Rome and then ancient Greece. And that to me gives something roots. You know, a tree can't grow without roots. And I think it was Jung who said that, you know, a lack of knowledge about the past, not just your own past, not just your own journey, although that's absolutely fundamental as well, but a knowledge of where you stand in the world as a human being, what's gone before you, you know, what are the sort of key points in history which reflect this shifting consciousness and approach towards the world, which for us, I suppose, in the West here was the Renaissance, which was then followed by the Reformation, and then the Reformation, which preempted the Enlightenment, which were key points in our history. And Jung said, you know, without that sort of understanding, that it's a mutilation of the self. And that really resonated with me as well in terms of, you know, understanding Renaissance art from that point of view as well.
Definitely. I mean, I absolutely love Jung when he sort of talks about the fact that, you know, there are cycles within cycles, and the past is always rolling back, you know, rolling back up towards us, and, you know, reaching out towards us, and we're sort of reaching back into it. I think he talks about that, you know, in a really beautiful way in the Red Book. So I'd highly recommend that, you know, for people to have a look at, because we are created from all of these experiences, and everything comes with I think Ken Wilber calls it, everything has its dignity and its disaster. Everything comes with, you know, this sort of different sides, different qualities, and it's how do we now, I think the question that's being asked, I think, of us is how do we hold all of those different perspectives, those different narratives, those different ways of seeing. And particularly in my own work, it was about, you know, and I talk about this in my thesis, it's about, you know, how do we move from a very kind of head-based rationalist approach to the world, which has kind of put all knowledge here. Obviously, I know that McGilchrist talks about left and right brain hemispheres, but in terms of my own work, it's very much about, you talked about severing before, how our head has kind of become severed from the body. And so in my own metaphor that I use in my own work, it's sort of how do we kind of bring the body back together with the head, and in my case the heart, to bring the head and the heart to talk together. Because just as I use the analogy of the plant, you know, having the roots and the leaves and the stem and the flower, you know, as beings living in the world, we are a whole self, a whole body. And, you know, Tom Cheetham talks a lot about this. He says, well, we spend our life jammed in our heads, you know, moving back into a sort of bodily felt place. And what makes meaning for me is the sort of space of the heart, is how do we kind of bring these back together. So an idea of how the heart rolls up to the head and the head rolls back down to the heart. How do we bring these parts of ourselves back together to talk to each other again? And really, if you think about the theme of what we're talking about, Mary, it's about opening up conversation between things that have sort of been cut off and severed.
Absolutely. Yes, to gather them back in, really, and to
gather them back up. To
gather them back in, and, you know, let them, you know, transform. And also, I think one thing that appealed to me so much about Ian McGilchrist's work, that when you were talking there about these sort of different ways of seeing and knowing, in particular when it came to how we perceive art, because there are lots and lots of movements now that some people may have heard of. There's a slow art day, and, you know, then, you know, looking at art has been compared to a form of mindfulness, and then there's all the experiments that the brain imaging people have done, where they've found the mirror neurons in the brain, which, you know, if you look at a profound work of art, that there are neurons in your brain which will make you think that you're doing the same thing as the people in the painting or the statue. And embodied cognition, which I suppose Jung would have called active imagination. But they're all fine, and there's nothing wrong with those things, but they can become a little bit like a formula, or a little bit like a sort of a 3-step process. Right, if I do that, then I'll get that. And have to be very careful, I think, with those, because that can very easily slip into a rational way of doing something which is seemingly expansive. And I think for me, something that Ian McGilchrist said, which really struck a chord, when he says the left brain deals with representations, things which are represented in the world. So it sees it as something which is represented. And in art, all the time, the usual terminology is this is a representation of Jesus and Mary, or Venus and Mars, or whatever. But he said, when you look at things from the right hemisphere's view, it's not in the present moment either. It's presencing. And things presence themselves to you. So they're presencing all the time. And that's what I found so fascinating with his work, when I was thinking about the language that we, when we talk about images. So I say this is a presentation of Jesus and Mary, not just a representation. And that helps you see that a work of art is not a thing, but it is a living being.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think Henry Bortoft, a philosopher of science, who's a Goethean expert, he talks about, this idea of something presencing through our engagement, through our relationship with whatever it is that we're having a relationship with. So it's actually the appearance of something, and the appearance of something is brought into the appearing through our own engagement and expansiveness with that thing. So in that sense, it's hard to capture through language, because language kind of sort of kills the presencing or the aliveness of whatever it is that you're in relationship with. But it's the coming into being of that something, and that's alive with you as living beings in the world, whether that's a painting or a plant or whatever. That's anything.
And it's always changing. It's always changing, and it's always moving. It's not a static thing which remains the same all the time. And that's why, you could talk about the same work of art 6 times, but if I'm going to see it with a group at the gallery, never the same things are said about it.
No, never.
There might be some things which remain the same, the sort of hard facts, if you like, but people's responses and what we're seeing and how we're approaching it is going to be different every single time.
Of course. I mean, Henry Bortoft calls that, the difference between upstream thinking and downstream thinking. So downstream thinking is where you meet something as though you know it already. That's very left brain focused theory facts. Whereas upstream thinking is sort of becoming into relationship with something as though you don't know it already. And that subtle shift of attention changes everything.